Hi, and welcome to this video. Today, we're going to discuss the Book of Job. Our main concerns for this video are to provide some preliminary context to the Book of Job, a brief overview of the content in the Book of Job, and finally, ask two important questions about the Book of Job. One, who are the heroes and who are the villains? And two, is the Book of Job a Theodicy? That is it a response to the problem of evil that tries to justify God in the face of suffering and evil? Let's get started. There's a number of ideas we can keep in mind when discussing the Book of Job. Here, I'm going to explore three, and if it doesn't go without saying, we're just scratching the surface with these issues. There's much more discussion that could be had about any of the issues I present here. Issue number one, the source traditions of the Book of Job. Biblical scholars such as Bart Ehrman maintain that there are at least two separate sources that go into the Book of Job. The first source would be the prologue and the epilogue, the beginning part about God and the Satan talking to each other, and the end part about Job receiving recompense for all of his suffering. The second source comes from the dialogues in the Book of Job, Job and Job's friends discussing with each other. There could be other sources as well, for instance the monologue of wisdom in chapter 28. The important part here is to note that Ehrman maintains that the different sources have different viewpoints with regard to why suffering occurs. From the source tradition that brings us the prologue and the epilogue, these authors, according to Ehrman, maintain that suffering is a test for individuals. But from the authors of the source tradition that bring us the dialogues between Job and his friends, there doesn't seem to be a clear answer to the reason why suffering occurs. This is an important idea to keep in mind as we discuss the Book of Job, because it guards against the idea that there is one simplistic, coherent expression about suffering in the book itself. There may be multiple authors and multiple voices coalescing together, and maybe even at times in contradictory ways. Two, the genre of the book. The first thing that needs to be said about the genre of the Book of Job is there is debate as to whether or not it's history or whether or not it's parable. The famous Jewish rabbi Maimonides said that the book is a parable, not to be taken as literal history, but rather figurative, as a way of expressing the suffering of a people, perhaps Israel. Other authors, however, such as Thomas Aquinas, take it to be legitimate history. For my part, I'm going to tend toward the view of Maimonides here. Job reads like a parable. However, that said, there are other biblical authors who talk about Job as if he were a historical figure. For instance, the prophet Ezekiel and the author of the book of James, who maintains that Job is a good example of faithfulness and perseverance in the face of suffering. Another important point to make about genre is that Job falls within the broader tradition of wisdom literature. This is a genre of literature that conveys wisdom about God and what it means to be moral or a good person. Other books in this genre include Proverbs, Psalms, the Book of Wisdom. That one's a little bit on the nose, isn't it? Book of Wisdom? Not a lot of creativity in that title. Song of Songs, Sirach, and Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes. Did you dub it? Nice. A third issue we want to address about the Book of Job is the worlds of the text, particularly the world of the text and the world behind the text. Let's start with the world behind the text. Two important points can be made here. First, most scholars tend to date the Book of Job, at least in its final form, somewhere around the 6th century BCE. As with most dating of the biblical text, there's some debate behind this, especially when we start considering the dates of the different sources that have contributed to the Book of Job, if there are more than one. That said, a 6th century setting for the editing or the final redaction of the Book of Job helps us to give some light to the world behind the text. The editor would be aware, for instance, of the destruction of the northern kingdom in 722 BCE. He or she would also be aware of the force of Babylon, either the threat of Babylon upon Israel or the actual overtaking of Israel by Babylon, including the destruction of the temple and the taking of the people into exile. This backdrop helps us understand the Book of Job, the emphasis on suffering, especially the suffering of people who are supposed to be God's people. Another important backdrop to consider for the Book of Job is Deuteronomistic theology. Deuteronomistic theology comes from the book of Deuteronomy, and it's signified by a number of different themes. The most important theme for this video is the notion that the law is given to human beings by God, and God is just. Therefore, if you obey the law, you will be blessed, and if you disobey the law, you will be cursed. Let's take a look at a passage from the book of Deuteronomy that establishes this point. See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God. But turn away from that I am commanding you today, to follow other gods that you have not known. So the simplistic notion of Deuteronomistic theology is that if you obey the law, you will be blessed. If you disobey the law, you will be cursed. Job's going to have something to say about that. What about the world of the text? Well, according to the prologue, Job lives in the land of Oz. Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high. Oh, the land of Uz, not Oz. Yes, that does make that song less relevant. The exact location of the land of Uz is debated, but it's generally accepted that it's outside of Israel, either in the land of Edom or in the land of Aram. Having provided a very thumbnail sketch of some preliminary issues that we might consider before addressing the Book of Job, let's take a look at the actual content of the text itself. For the TLDR audience, those are the people, Carl, who keep bringing my video retention stats down because they just stop watching after like 5 minutes. What do you mean you don't watch more than 5 minutes? Carl, you help me make the videos. The real thumbnail sketch of it is this. God and some other character named Hasatan make a kind of wager of sorts that Job, who is considered very faithful to God, will not remain faithful to God once all of Job's blessings have been taken away. Hasatan strips Job of all of his blessings, and Job begins to make accusations against God. Job's friends, and I mean friends here like you are a friend to me, Carl, not really good friends, but just annoying people who kind of hang around, approach Job and try to convince him that he has actually sinned and deserves the punishment that God is giving him. Job maintains his innocence. Eventually God shows up and starts throwing thunderbolts and yelling and shouting, and Job's like, okay, sorry, never mind, I shouldn't have said anything. Then God gives Job shiny new children and a bunch of other things so that Job is better off than he was at the very beginning. But let's unpack that a little bit more. The prologue of the book of Job identifies Job as a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. God is meeting with God's heavenly court when all of a sudden this character, Hasatan, shows up, sometimes referred to as the Satan or just Satan. But as biblical scholar Michael Heiser argues, it's probably not best to think of Hasatan as the same as we think of the devil today. You know, that kind of red creature with a pitchfork and horns and just real evil and causing all kinds of problems, standing always in opposition to God. Heiser maintains that in the biblical court, Hasatan, which literally means the accuser, actually plays an important function. He's the accuser, the prosecutor. He goes to and fro on the earth to be God's eyes and ears, as it were, to bring to God's attention those who require accusation, prosecution. In this sense, this isn't some epic battle between God, who is good, and Satan, who is evil. Rather, it's a conversation within a heavenly court, by members of the heavenly court, about Job. Anyway, God kind of goads Hasatan a little bit, saying, hey, you're the accuser. Have you considered Job? He has nothing you can accuse him of. He's completely righteous and blameless. This leads Hasatan to point out that God has sort of formed a wall around Job and given him lots of blessings, and nothing really bad has ever happened to Job. And Hasatan says, well, if you took all that down, I bet you Job would curse you. This leads to a sort of wager between God and Hasatan. And the wager is simple. God gives Hasatan increasing power to essentially obliterate Job's well-being, his possessions, his family, and his personal health, to the point where Job is just a possessionless, childless, boil-covered shell of the man he once was? Kind of a mean bet if you think about it, Carl. Anyway, this prologue ends with Job in this absolute destitute state, when all of a sudden his 3 friends come to visit him. And this leads to the dialogues. From chapter 3 to chapter 27, there's this ongoing dialogue between Job and his friends. And it has a very cyclical nature to it. Job begins the conversation by essentially saying, I wish I never would have been born. That would have been better. And he also maintains his innocence. That is, Job does not believe he deserves what has happened to him. Again, keep in mind that Deuteronomistic theology. Job has not done evil, and the prologue affirms this. Job is blameless and righteous, innocent. By Deuteronomistic theology, Job should not be suffering. He should be blessed, and yet he is suffering. Job's friends represent the height of Deuteronomistic theology. They are convinced that if Job is suffering in this way, he must have done something to deserve it. No one gets cursed like this unless they've committed some sin or have been disobedient in some serious manner. So in essence, Job's friends accuse him, saying things like, think now, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed. And so, Job, if you're being consumed, it's your fault. Job, however, again maintains his innocence. In a stark departure from Deuteronomistic theology, Job maintains that God destroys both the righteous and the wicked. He also laments that there is no referee that can serve as an impartial judge between him and God. That is, someone who can maintain the righteousness of Job's plea, of his lament, or even his accusation against God. Job boldly claims that God is pursuing Job, that is, causing him grief and pain, even though God knows that Job is innocent. And finally, Job starkly maintains that he is in fact innocent and blameless. Again, the dramatic irony here, from the canonical perspective, is that we know that Job is right. Job has not in fact done anything wrong. He has been identified as blameless and innocent, even by God in the prologue. But Job's friends can't accept this. The only way for their worldview to be maintained is if Job's suffering can be traced back to something that Job has done to deserve it. After the dialogues, we enter into a set of monologues, 3 in particular. The first is identified as a Song of Wisdom, a general interlude in which some random song of wisdom enters into the text and doesn't really have much to do with what came before it or what comes after it, but just kind of thrown in there in the middle. Think of it like a bridge featuring Pitbull in any pop song from the 2000s. The second monologue consists of Job's closing thoughts. 3 particular themes stand out in Job's monologue. First, Job recalls the good old days when he was in fact blessed and everyone respected him. But he also recalls that in those good old days, he took care of the poor, the needy, the marginalized. In other words, Job was not just concerned with his own well-being, but he consistently practiced justice, which is a huge theme of the Mosaic Law, by helping those around him. The second theme is that Job laments that everyone, including God, have turned their backs on Job. And in an interesting thematic parallel, Job essentially accuses God of not doing the good that Job himself has done. You see, Job has not turned his back on the needy, the suffering, the poor. When he had the ability to help them, he did. But God doesn't seem to do that. Consider this passage. Surely one does not turn against the needy. When in disaster they cry for help. Did I not weep for those whose day was hard? Was not my soul grieved for the poor? But when I looked for good, evil came. When I waited for light, darkness came. Job appears to be taking a page from Moses' book here, in accusing God, saying, I'm actually more moral than you are. I reached out to the poor and needy when they were hurting, but you are not reaching out to me. Them's fighting words. The third theme is that Job acknowledges that if he had committed sin, if he had been unrighteous, if he had been unfaithful to his wife, or if he had worshipped other gods, or if he had not been concerned for the needy and the marginalized in his community, he would have deserved the calamity that fell upon him. But he hasn't done these things, and so he doesn't understand why he's suffering. After Job's monologue, a fourth friend bursts onto the scene, Elihu, and he just starts accusing everyone. He rebukes Job's friends, he rebukes Job, and then he spends a lot of time justifying or defending God in the face of Job's accusations. Consider this passage. Hear me, you who have sense. Far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and far from the Almighty that he should do wrong. For according to their deeds he will repay them, and according to their ways he will make it befall them. Of a truth, God will not do wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice. Even though Elihu rebukes Job's friends, he essentially repeats the same argument. God does not punish the righteous, only the wicked. If you're wicked, you get punishment. If you're obedient, you get blessed. Elihu therefore repeats the basic tenet of Deuteronomistic theology. After Elihu's speech, God finally shows up on the scene, and not without a little bit of fashion. The text states that God speaks from the whirlwind. What's the status of this whirlwind, Carl? Has it like been there the whole time and no one's noticing it? It's just like sneaking up on them? Like that T-Rex from the end of Jurassic Park, you know, when they're in the little museum thing and there's these raptors attacking the people and all of a sudden this T-Rex eats one of the raptors? Like, how do you not see a T-Rex there? How does a T-Rex sneak up on you? And how did he get in there? Did he go through the door? This T-Rex thing really bothers me. Anyway, God speaks from the whirlwind and essentially asks Job where Job was when God had created and established the foundations of the earth, and whether or not Job can actually preserve the earth as God does. Of course, the answer to this is Job wasn't around when God did that, and no, Job can't preserve the earth in the same way that God does. This leads Job to say, you know, maybe I should have kept my mouth shut. But God's not finished. God wants to say more.
Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you declare to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God? And can you thunder with a voice like this?
Will you put me in the wrong? Will you accuse me so that you can be justified? Are you looking at me? You must be looking at me because there's no other God here. Here, God's argument essentially comes down to, I did a bunch of cool stuff, and also, I continue to do a bunch of cool stuff, and also, look how my voice can thunder. Is that a good argument? Are we convinced by this? I don't know. Seems weak to me. God also talks about intense animals that God has created, the behemoth and the leviathan, that only God can subdue. And again, Job backs down, saying, I despise myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. After God's speeches and Job's repentance, we come to the epilogue, where God rebukes Job's friends and actually makes those friends go to Job for forgiveness. Interestingly enough, God says, you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. We'll come back to that statement in a second. Also, God restores everything that Job had lost. He has even more stuff than he had before, and he has 3 sons and 7 daughters, so he gets shiny new children. That's good. So I guess all's well that ends well. Or does it? Let's evaluate the book of Job by asking 2 fundamental questions. First, who are the heroes and villains in the book of Job? And as we ask this question, let's keep a keen eye to a more specific question. Is God a hero or a villain in the book of Job? As in the book of James, chapter 5, verse 13, Job is often understood as a paragon of faithfulness. Job is understood as someone who is perseverant and patient in the face of suffering, who maintains his relationship to God in the face of suffering. And in the book of James, this is to encourage others who suffer in this world. Look, Job did it, you can do it. In this reading, Job is undoubtedly a hero, but so is God. They are both presented as heroes, and of course, it'd be hard for someone to think of God as a villain. Or would it? In post-Holocaust Jewish theology, Job has been read slightly differently. Now, to be clear, not all Jewish theology post-Holocaust has been the same, but there are a number of voices who have highlighted that the book of Job can be read very differently with regard to why Job is a hero and whether or not God is a hero. I'll briefly present two examples to make this case. The first is the post-Holocaust thinker Ernest Bloch. Bloch maintains that the book of Job represents a rejection of theodicy, in that it never actually answers the question as to why God permits suffering, or why God is justified in the face of suffering. For Bloch, this reading specifically goes against the backdrop of the destruction of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Israel. You have a group of people who are desperately suffering and feel abandoned by God. Job represents their angst, their suffering, their rejection, their feeling of abandonment. But for Bloch, Job is not a hero because of his perseverance, patience, faith in the sense of never accusing God. Bloch notes that Job does in fact accuse God, and this accusation against God is what makes Job a hero. Job does not take his suffering or punishment lying down. He does not say, God, you are God and I am not. He says, God, face me. Face me in court even. Hear my question. Why am I suffering? I have done nothing wrong. Tell me why this is just that this should be happening to me. And as Bloch notes, God never actually answers that question. The thundering monologue that God offers toward the end of the book doesn't ever address the questions that Job asks. It just says, look at all the cool stuff I've done, look at all the cool stuff I'm continuing to do, check out how big my arm is, and also listen to how deep my voice is. None of these respond to Job's accusations against God. And for Bloch, the God of the whirlwind is a sort of false God. The real God, the God of hope, is the God who hears the lament and protest that Job brings against God throughout the book. In this sense, the God of the whirlwind is a villain, and Job's protest and lament against God is what makes Job the hero. We find a similar reading in the work of Elie Wiesel, another post-Holocaust writer. And again, Wiesel maintains that Job is a hero not because he acquiesces to God's judgment, but rather because he fights against it. In the prophetic tradition, Job does not say your will be done, but challenges God's decision, as we talked about Moses challenging God's desire to destroy Israel back in Exodus. Job does not accept God's judgment. Job challenges it, and in Wiesel's mind, this makes Job a hero. One reason this claim is very fascinating from the perspective of Wiesel is that while Wiesel was in Auschwitz, he claims to have witnessed a trial in which some Jewish scholars, some Talmudic scholars, put God on trial for abandoning the covenant of Israel, and they actually find God guilty of abandoning the covenant. God has struck Israel for no good reason. That's the finding of the trial. And the connection to Job is very clear. Job is innocent, yet he suffers. But he doesn't suffer for a good reason. Thus, his accusation against God is just. Based on the book of Job, Wiesel, being the ever-quotable author that he is, writes, "It is given to man to transform divine injustice into human justice and compassion." So when we ask who are the heroes and who are the villains of the book of Job, well, it might seem like there's an easy answer. Job's friends are the villains, Satan is the villain, God's the hero, Job's the hero. But the text doesn't clearly support that reading. Whether or not Job is a villain or a hero is up for grabs. After all, Job does accuse God, and if we think God is a hero, maybe Job is wrong in accusing God. But if we think Job is a hero in his accusations and his laments, and we actually do know that Job is innocent, well, God doesn't come off very heroic in the text then. Even though God does redeem Job, so to speak, give him new children and new possessions and all that sort of stuff, God still never responds to Job's fundamental question, why did you do this? Our second question regards whether or not Job is a theodicy. And that is to say, does the book of Job attempt to justify God in the face of suffering? Does it provide an answer that exonerates God? A number of theologians have maintained that Job does provide a theodicy, inasmuch as it reminds us that mere human beings have no business questioning God's judgment or God's justice. When Job backs down and repents at the end of the narrative, for these theologians, this is the reminder to all human beings, you do not question God. God's ways are mysterious, beyond your own ways. You could never understand them. And if God tried to explain them, you would just be put in your place and silently acquiesce and repent in dust and ashes. In essence, then, the book of Job approaches Theodicy by saying it's a mystery humans could never understand, and they must remain faithful then to God, maintain trust in God. Personally, I do not find this position very convincing, and there are 3 reasons why. The first reason is that the book doesn't really fulfill the function of an actual theodicy as we think of it today. The book never actually provides a reason to justify God, a reason to believe that God is exonerated. Sure, it does present God as one who creates things and who has a lot of power, but it never justifies God in the face of Job's suffering. It does not provide an answer in that sense, and because it doesn't provide an answer, it doesn't really fulfill the function of a theodicy. Second, the idea that we should think of the point of Job as to remain silent before God and just trust God is rather a strange reading of the text, partly because Job constantly accuses God, protests against God, and laments his situation throughout the entire text. Furthermore, in the canonical version of the text, we know that Job's right. Job is innocent. He is blameless. He is righteous. He has done nothing to deserve what is happening to him. The questions that Job is asking God, why is this happening to me? Why are you doing nothing? Why are you pursuing me? Why are these terrible things happening when I am a righteous and good person? These are all valid questions. And the implications of Job's argument is that even though God requires human beings in the Mosaic Law to reach out to the poor and the marginalized, God won't do this in the case of Job. In essence, Job is the innocent sufferer who never receives a good response for why he is suffering innocently. Hardly a theodicy. And finally, in the canonical version of the text, we know why Job is suffering. He's suffering because God and Hasatan make a wager. Will Job remain faithful to God in the face of all of this torturous suffering? Animals die, children die, all of Job's wealth is gone, his health gets decimated. All of this to settle a kind of wager between God and Hasatan. And God never admits this to Job, even though Job asks, why is this happening to me? God never says, well, let me tell you a story. One day I was sitting in my court, Hasatan shows up, he's walking all big and cocky. I'm like, hey, have you seen Job? And one thing leads to the next. And the next thing we know, you're sitting in a bunch of dust and ashes, cutting boils on your skin with a bunch of dead children behind you. Things happen. For these 3 reasons, a number of theologians and biblical scholars, and I include myself among them, don't think of Job as a theodicy, but more of an anti-theodicy. In other words, it refuses to exonerate God in the face of suffering. Yes, in some sense it leaves it a mystery, but it doesn't present God in a very clearly heroic, good light. In the book, Job seems to be in the right. And God even states to Job's friends at one point, you have not spoken right about me, as my servant Job has. But Job's been spending all of his time accusing God. Is that speaking right about God? Is God admitting God's wrong? Some people have even gone so far as to suggest that when God gives Job all these things at the end, it's sort of an apology. Now, I don't necessarily see that in the text to be clear, but it's an interesting way of reading it. The point here is to note that the book of Job does have some contradictory elements in it. And because there are these contradictory elements, it's difficult to tell who the heroes and who the villains are. For my part, I find the reading most convincing that Job is a hero, partly in his accusation against God, partly in his protest and his lament of innocent suffering. God does not come off in a positive light in my reading of the text. But that doesn't make me right. How do you read the text? Do you think Job is a hero? And why is he a hero? Is God a hero or a villain in the text? That's all for now. Until next time, farewell.